Thanks for coming along to this talk this morning. So I'm Nikki Yoxall. I'm head of research at Pasture For Life, which is an organisation that promotes the restorative power of grazing livestock at pasture. Just a quick plug, we have a table in the tent on the other side of the river. If you're interested in the work that Pasture For Life are doing, please come and have a chat with either me or my colleague Sarah. We can talk more about the research that we're involved in, but also our membership offer, which is half price for you lovely people if you're interested in joining. And we can also talk a little bit about our certification program. So my quick Get Pasture For Life plug in at the start is done, so I'll be able to carry on with what I want to cover today. Just to say, as well as working at Pasture For Life as head of research, I'm also a grazier based in the northeast of Scotland, in Aberdeenshire. My husband and I run a grazier business working with landowners to improve the quality of soil and also biodiversity outcomes. And I'm currently studying a PhD as well. So quite a lot going on, but hopefully what I'm going to be able to do this morning is just talk a little bit about Regen Ag and what the research is telling us. Now, I'm sure many of you will have seen this before. The lovely folk at Groundswell produced this excellent diagram, which is also available as a tea towel. Highly recommend. It's a good talking point in your kitchen. And this basically gives us this overview of the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture as determined, particularly, I would say, more from a kind of arable focus, where we talk about diversity, livestock integration into arable systems, protecting the soil surface, minimizing soil disturbance, and maintaining living roots. And hopefully you're all going to stay for the Understanding Ag talks this afternoon, where they'll go much more into this idea of principles and understanding how we kind of build these frameworks. But as a starting point, as a quick intro this morning, this is a good place to sort of dip your toe. But the most important thing that I think is missing from this list is the idea of context. And for any of you who are interested in holistic management, determining your context, your holistic context, is a really key, important part. And so what I think is important is that we understand from the outset that when we talk about regenerative agriculture, it's way more than a bunch of practices. And that's why the research into Regen Ag is so difficult to quantify. Because for those of us that are kind of doing some of this stuff, we're not looking at, in this field, I'm going to test this one thing. We think in terms of systems, we think in terms of context. All of our work is about managing trade-offs and creating a balance in our system. So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind, that when we're asked to kind of present, well, what does the research tell us about Regen Ag? Does it work or not? Well, quite often the way that research is conducted never really reflects the reality on a farm that is a kind of into, really stepping into Regen Ag, because quite often the research space and trials aren't able to take into account systems thinking and context dependency. So it's just a caveat to start with, really. And I also want to highlight that kind of a lot of this stuff isn't new, and what I'm really going to be focusing on today is the kind of livestock element of Regen Ag. That's kind of my bag. It's what I'm interested in. It's what I do. So if you've got arable questions, I'm not the person to ask. But I just want to highlight, that this stuff, this idea of moving animals, creating rest in the system, which is one of the best ways that you can create improved ground cover, and that you can also increase the opportunity for living roots in the soil. If you haven't read Grass Productivity by André Voisin, read it. It was written in the 50s, absolutely brilliant book, and it really gives you an understanding of the kind of context and the ideas behind moving animals frequently. Top photo just to kind of indicate, the shearlings. Where I live in Scotland, it was just such a normal thing to be moving animals around, to take them from summer hill grazings down to the Imbai in winter. The movement of animals in the uplands has been has deep cultural connotations for many of us. And obviously in the Swiss and French Alps, the movement of cows to summer pastures, again, that idea of moving animals, creating rest, particularly in the growing season, is so important. So I'm not going to stand here and pretend that anything that I'm talking about is new. It really isn't. These are very old ideas, but we have new ways of interpreting them and incorporating them into our systems as they stand. And we also have to remember that this is within a context of systems that have been simplified and homogenized since the Second World War, which is coming back to my point about the challenge around the context. It's very easy to take what is learned in a trial and apply it to a field if you're embracing all-out control in terms of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. If you're harnessing the power of biological systems, it's so context dependent, so it really is tricky. I feel like all I'm doing is giving you kind of reasons why I don't know what I'm talking about. That's not what I meant to do at the start of this talk, but it really is, kind of taking that information and then applying it into new systems like ours. So this is a couple of heifers in some of our tall grass grazing. Yes, they're small cows, but we do have tall grass. So, ideas around whether grass is productive or not and what the animal's actually getting out of it. Within research settings, you're not going to find pasture that looks like this on a research platform farm. They just won't do it. So we also have to remember that some of the greatest knowledge that we can glean is from each other, from our peer networks, right? Because no one on a research platform is going to let that grass go to head like that in that kind of permanent pasture. So it's really, really important that we liaise and respect the knowledge of our peers. Lots and lots of text on here, and I'm really happy to circulate slides to anyone who wants them. But I think what's important is that there was a really interesting review done in 2008 for DEFRA in England that looked at the role that diverse pastures have. So when we start thinking about the research, this great literature review really did pull together so much of the information, particularly in relation to the role of legumes, identifying that these kind of functional groups of diverse plants results in improved yield stability and permanence through various mechanisms. And that can be that we've got different plants that respond to different weather conditions or to different grazing management that are able to thrive when one plant is maybe getting burnt off, other plants are coming through. So back in 2022, we saw really nice examples of folks with more diverse pastures, and the bird's foot trefoil was absolutely thriving whilst everything else was kind of burning off and struggling. So, we know that having a more diverse set of plants in our systems will support us to have more resilient systems. The complementary patterns of resource use by components of these mixtures allow us to have better ecosystem functioning, such as nutrient retention. And that's just a fancy way of saying if we've got different plants with different root profiles, all playing a different role, attractive to different pollinators, again, that resilience is increased. And it also means that we get a promotion in the increase in number of range of habitats, so from vertebrates and birds. And the idea of cascading effects, which again, if you listen to Stuart and to Kyle later, that's something that they will talk a lot about, compounding and cascading effects from these systems. The microbial diversity will be enhanced in multi-species grass legume mixtures. And something that I find is absolutely fascinating, that was the work that has been done in more recent years by Andy Neal at Rothamsted, basically identified that the greater the connected porosity, so I want you to imagine in your mind a block of soil that you've dug out of the ground, and if you imagine through it, there's all these tiny little pores and kind of networks of airways that are running through that soil. So we're not thinking compacted soil, we're thinking lovely, healthy, chocolate cake crumb type soil with all those airways that are running through it. Those connected airways, capillary network, is something called connected porosity. And the researchers at Rothamsted found that the greater the connected porosity, not only the more diverse the soil microbiological organisms, but for those simple-celled organisms, the more genetically diverse they were. So the DNA profile of individual organisms became more complex with greater connected porosity. So the healthier our soils, the more genetically capable the soil microorganisms are to be healthier, to promote those healthier systems, and to deal with more, to develop resilience in that system. So it's going right down to that genetic level. We're able to identify that if we keep these soils healthier, then it's a quid pro quo, right, with the microorganisms that are living there. We also know that as I said, that porosity can be supported by increased legumes in our soil, in our swards as well. So it works both ways. And the inclusion of these species has not just the potential, but actually measurable benefits in terms of improving the quality of meat and milk. So at Pasture For Life, we've been involved in quite a lot of research to show that the omega-3 fatty acid profile and another number of other micro and macronutrients are improved, are better for human health, the greater the diversity of the swards that the plant and the animals are eating. The minute for dairy systems, the minute we incorporate cake in the parlour, we reduce the nutrient benefit of the milk that is produced. it works on a day-to-day basis in a dairy system. As many of you, if you're dairy farmers, you'll know that what you're feeding to the animal, what comes out in the milk within the next following days is affected by what they're eating. So the minute we start feeding cake in a parlour, the nutrient quality of that milk the following day is reduced compared to if it's fully off pasture. Now, I'm not saying that you should need to stop feeding cake. What I'm saying is that we have a really good reason to increase the proportion of forage in diets for livestock. And the more diverse that forage, the greater the difference in terms of human health benefit, to the extent that meat from animals that are 100% pasture-fed on diverse native species grasses and plants, the omega-3 content of that meat can be considered protective of human health. So we all hear the stories, right, that red meat's bad for your health. Well, actually, the level of omega-3 to omega-6, that ratio in that fully pasture-fed system means that that meat actually becomes protective of health. It's beneficial for human consumption as opposed to being at risk. So these are all things that we're starting to understand and that we're starting to develop that awareness of. We also have the delivery of condensed tannins to the diet through the inclusion of forage legumes, so thinking particularly around things like bird's foot trefoil, has the potential to improve important aspects of health and welfare, particularly in relation to reducing anthelmintics. In our system, we've not given any drenches, no wormers, nothing at all like that, no porons in 6 years. We just don't need to. We fecal egg count, and I'm absolutely convinced not only is it the movement of animals, so everything's moved every day, but also the diversity of the pasture that is reducing our requirement for inputs. When we move on from 2008 and we come a little bit more into sort of the 2010s, there is some really interesting research in relation to methane emissions as well. So we know that the amount of research that's happening in relation to emissions is increasing, with so many suggestions being around inhibitors or additional supplements. But actually, I think what we're starting to see is that there's a much greater potential for diverse pastures to deliver some of that for us. And there's some great research happening, I think, out of Belfast by a brilliant young PhD student who's been looking at the use of willow to reduce methane emissions from lambs as well. But we do know in this research in 2014 that heifers that were fed, so this is dairy heifers, fed a forage mixture rich in native wildflowers, and I think that was key here, produced less methane. So again, a really, really good story in terms of if you're thinking about your product that you're selling, you've got these positive messages. And we also know, as I said, this fatty acid profile reflected by increased levels of the improvement, so the improvement of the diversity in the pastures led to improved fatty acid profile in the meat. I would also really recommend, there's a brilliant webinar, I've just taken a screenshot, which is in relation to multi-species mixtures as a pillar for agroecology. Go and listen to that webinar. I think it's about an hour long or something. And it's just some really, really good, solid research in relation to that multi-species mixtures. And this was Agroecology Transect, which was a European study. If you've just got an evening and you've got nothing else to do, don't watch Netflix, put that on instead. Really, really nice research outcomes that I would really recommend having a watch of that. And the work that Chris Reynolds at Reading has done, who's been involved in some of that work, is really worth looking out as well. Right, quick time check. So, but it doesn't just have to be plants that we kind of think are attractive or that we like. And this is one of my favorite slides because it shows that my love of of the broadleaf dock is well established, and there's reason for that. When we start thinking about weeds that we don't like, or plants, I find it difficult to say the word weed. I'm very much a believer that all plants are amazing and they all have a role to play. But I also recognize that for many people, a field of docks is a challenge. But I think we sometimes overlook their capacity to deliver the things that we need. And I've been on farms before with these really kind of sexy herbal lays that have been put in, and we dig up a chicory plant, and I'm like, that's really cool. And we go into the next field and we dig up a dock, and I'm like, can you tell the difference between these roots? Maybe not. So I think, sometimes remembering that these plants have a role to play, not only in fixing the soil for us, but also giving us an indicator of what's going on so that we can start reading the landscape better, and we can start thinking about how we might want to change our grazing management. But we also know that these plants have represent a really positive opportunity for improved nutrition as well. So thinking about magnesium and the content of docks of magnesium compared to ryegrass, and then it makes absolute sense to me that just before calving, all of our cows are going mad for those docks and are happily kind of seeking them out, move on to a new break, loads of grass, go straight to the docks and start eating them. And also, again, the same for creeping buttercup. There's some concerns about buttercup creating ulcers in the mouth for some animals, but ours absolutely devour it. They really love it. And when you look at this and you see the presence of all of those different mineral profile of those plants, you start to understand why let's think about why our animals are eating these things. And I would say that you get to notice more of this if you're not bolusing, if you're not giving mineral blocks. I'm not suggesting you stop that, you remove that. It's a big change to make to an animal. But if you've got animals that are coming in, that are kind of getting used to a system where you're not having to give those other inputs, you do start to see this kind of selective grazing of particular plants a little bit more. And I think trusting in those animals to know what they're doing is quite, it takes a bit of time, but you do start to see the benefits. There we go. And I think just to build on that, agroforestry, silvopasture is a huge part of our system, and it represents so many benefits. I'm not going to go into, I could speak for hours and hours and hours about this. If you are interested, come and find me on our stand in the tent, because I'll bore you for the rest of the day about the benefits of silvopasture. But from a dietary point of view, again, looking at the different component parts of different plants, so perennial ryegrass compared to goat willow, compared to hazel, compared to rowan, we can see that actually we've got different profile of those minerals in those plants. So this isn't just about having trees because they're good for all the reasons they're good for in terms of the landscape or creating shelter, but actually their browse has a significant potential to deliver some of those nutrients, and also at particular times. One that's missing off here that I didn't include was hawthorn, which in the spring has a really high, it has a spike in iron content, which again, really interesting if you're thinking about animals that are calving or lambing in the spring, that need for the risk of reducing the amount of iron that they have if a difficult birth, for example. So going and eating that hawthorn and having access to higher iron at a particular time of year, it just kind of shows that nature's got this. And we're pretty good at interfering and getting in the way and creating problems where they probably don't need to be. And I just want to spend the rest of this kind of opportunity to talk to you about grazing management and some of the research that sits around this. And it really is this idea of graze and rest and impact and recovery. We know from the research that has been undertaken across a number of different countries that AMP, so adaptive multi-paddock grazing, involves as clearly enhances soil structure, increases organic matter, improves water retention by promoting deep-rooted plants, reduces the incidence of parasites, encourages diverse nutrient-rich forage consumption, and increases carrying capacity. So why wouldn't we want to do it? It literally ticks off all the things that we need it to have better, more resilient outcomes. And for me, that's what Regen Ag is about. It's about resilience, right? We need to have resilient systems that are able to deliver a financial return at length, over the coming years, and a system that isn't affected by external shocks to the system. So if we can have a grazing system, and I can put my time, energy, thought, consideration into planning my grazing and managing my grazing, and that's the thing that delivers that resilience, for me, that makes financial sense, because I'm not having to rely on buying something in to deliver that shorter term resilience. Just as a note of caution around language, I guess, and terminology. So I'm going to talk a lot about AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock, because that's where quite a lot of the research is now using that terminology. There's a real challenge for us if we use the word mob grazing, for example, some of the researchers are using that to mean quite a prescriptive, fixed way of grazing, and that, I think, is unhelpful. So there's currently a project over in GB at the moment that's being run by ADAS, which is looking at mob grazing and comparing mob grazing to set stocking. But the mob grazing has no room for flexibility. So, for example, the guys that are on the farms delivering this mob grazing, they had to determine that it's this number of animals in this size paddocks moved this frequently with this rest period. There's no adaptability in that. And in the real world, we don't manage it. Well, we shouldn't really be managing those adaptive systems like that, because if it absolutely buckets down with rain at 10 o'clock at night, you're probably going to move those animals first thing in the morning even if normally you'd move them in the afternoon, right? We all respond and adapt to the conditions that we're in. So one of the challenges that exists out there, one of the real limitations about the research is it doesn't allow for that more adaptive approach. Some of the work that's been done in the US that has been supported by Peter Bick and some of the team that he's working with, if you haven't seen Carbon Cowboys videos on YouTube, then I really recommend looking them up. And also go to the Roots So Deep website. So it's Roots So Deep, you can see the devil down there. There's 4 films or kind of long documentaries, just over an hour each. They're not that expensive to stream, and you'll be able to see some of the research that's been done there, which I'm going to touch on in a moment. And that's being done on a systems level. So they take a bunch of AMP grazing farms, and then they do a duplicate study where they find another farm in the same location, sometimes over the fence, that is set stock, like continuous grazing, and then they're comparing at a systems level, which is absolutely what we need. That we need so much more funding to be looking at these systems in comparison. So rather than saying, oh, this farm is, rather than on a research platform where there is a role for that, of course, but it's really, really difficult to assess adaptive systems when you're having to reduce them down to a particular plant growing in a particular way or measuring the particular impact of a particular animal on a particular moment. Actually, what we need far more of is these kind of systems level research programs, which are not cheap, right? They're not cheap and they take long time and we need them to be carried out over a number of years. And so because of the way that research is funded, that can be problematic. But what they have been able to do is basically pull in private funding so that they're not relying on research councils, they're not relying on the university to get the money to do this. It's about privately funded research that is then able to pave the way for multi-year experimental work at a systems level. And so, yeah, really, really recommend having a look at both of those sets of resources. And we can see kind of differences if we're looking. So this is not in America, this is in Scotland. So on the left-hand side, we've got continuous set stock. So both of these pictures were taken in spring. So one is continuous set stock and the other is adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So our system on the right and a neighbouring system on the left. And you can just see the difference. When we think back to those principles of regenerative agriculture, of keeping living roots in the ground, of having that diversity, on the left-hand side, I could barely dig a hole, which is why I ended up chipping this tiny little bit of like soil out of the ground. And on the right-hand side, we had this lovely big, spade's width of block of soil that we could take out. You can see that there's worms in there, lovely deep roots, lots of that porosity that we talked about. And so being able to have a look at systems that are next door to each other really does help us to understand the impact of the work that we're doing. And so just, if you're not familiar with this kind of AMP grazing approach that I've been whittering on about without giving you any guidance on what it was, so sorry for that, I'll just give you a very quick run through. So traditional, and I don't like the term traditional, but I stole this image and the language was already there from Sarah Morgan, who's now at Harper and was at Rothamsted. And Sarah has been leading some brilliant, well, she was leading before she moved away from Rothamsted on this work around kind of mob grazing and cell grazing approaches. So she did this really useful graphic that basically said, kind of this grazing management that we've been doing probably sort of since the sort of 60s onwards, where we just put animals in a field and we leave them there and we kind of come back in a few months and go, all right, yeah, they've eaten all that down, so we'll move them out. Does have some benefits in terms of, fixed watering points. Low labour input, I would argue, because actually I think quite often the challenges of these systems is that they require more input later on, and also you're going to have to gather all those animals in and take them somewhere else rather than just rotating them around. So the idea of kind of these more traditional, questionable language choice there, systems, is that you're kind of putting animals somewhere and they're not really moving, and you're not really utilising rest as a tool in your toolbox. And instead, these more adaptive grazing management approaches really rely on graze and rest. And so that could be through these kind of hub and spoke, where you've got a fixed water point and you're moving animals around it. It could be where you've got water in the middle of a field and you're able to rotate around the water. It could be a mob grazing system where you're maybe moving daily and those animals are moving around, or a cell grazing system, which is even greater density of animals. So remembering that stocking rate and stocking density are two different things. Stocking rate is the number of animals across the whole grazing platform for that year. The stocking density is how many animals we have in a particular area of land for a particular period of time. So it could be kilos of animals per hectare for 24 hours. That would be our stocking density. Our stocking rate would be how many livestock units we have across the whole of the grazing platform hectares. I very nearly said kilos per acre then. I thought I'd really mix up our metric and imperial. Yeah, so these graze and rest systems, and I think what's important about adaptive multi-paddock grazing is that it could be any of those at any time in the year. There are times in the year where we are more hub and spoke, and maybe those animals are on there for 3 days because it's where we can get water to, and it's not the growing season, it's the winter. So we're going to be a little bit more relaxed about how quickly we're moving animals because we're not worrying about the grass getting bitten off before it's ready to be regrazed behind them. And then sometimes we might be in more of a paddock grazing system, again, limited by water. And the majority on our setting is mob grazing, so daily moves, and probably with rest periods ranging anywhere from around 60 to 180 days. And in some places, we're only grazing them once in the year. And then particularly in the spring, we might have more of a cell grazing approach where we're moving quickly. So we're skimming across that grazing platform, we're moving nice and fast, and we're leaving lots of residual behind. So the way that we manage our grazing should never really be fixed because it's dependent on the time of the year, it's dependent on the grazing conditions, whether it's absolutely poured down with rain the night before and you need to get those animals moved on. So I think the key thing that the research very much is looking at quite fixed systems. We're all delivering quite adaptive systems on farms, so there's always going to be a mismatch between what the research is telling us and what we want to be able to deliver. But there are times when it can be quite useful in terms of looking at manure distribution, for example. So these are things that we can look at on these more adaptive systems. And I thought this was really, really interesting. So if we're looking to reduce our fertilizer cost, we're looking to reduce our bills, for example, because we all know that the price of fertilizer obviously skyrocketed and is stabilizing a bit, but the fact that we're open to the risks of those costs is challenging. We also know that it has negative implications for soil health in some settings as well. So if we have continuous grazing, so we've got our field there on the left-hand side, we've got our water down the bottom, what happens is these animals go in there, because cows, and I'm focusing on cattle because I don't really like sheep, but cows are my thing. So our cows are going to just hang out around the water, right? They're really lazy. That's what prey animals do. They don't move unless something tells them to move. They're really, really lazy. And so they'll hang out around the water, they'll go and drink, they'll maybe urinate, defecate, and then they'll wander off, and the kind of manure distribution is focused around the water and then gets less, which is why whenever you go into fields that have got fixed water points, with animals that are just set stocked, you'll see docks, thistles and nettles hanging out around the water because they're responding to that nitrogen load and that compaction. If we then start moving those animals a little bit more around that field and we put in the water in the middle, we start to see a manure distribution that changes. So it's still focused around the water because that's where the animals are hanging out, but it's less extreme than in the first example. And then if we start moving animals more frequently and we're moving the water and we're moving those animals on and we're kind of getting them across that pasture, our manure distribution is far more even across the pasture. And that means that we're able to optimize the nutrient cycling across the pasture without it just being in one area and not another. Because cattle are an incredible tool. Sheep can be too, but cattle really are an incredible tool, right? So let's use they've got legs, so let them walk to where they need to eat the food from. They're cycling those nutrients internally and then dropping them on the pasture for us. So instead of having to cart muck everywhere, let them do the hard work, right? Because they're going to do it anyway. So let them do it at pasture and let them spread it equally across the pasture with a little bit of polywire enabling you to do that. I've mentioned some of the research limitations already. As I've said, much of it has a US focus. So for those of us in the UK and Ireland, it's really, really difficult to often convince folk who need convincing that it is still relevant. It is relevant, regardless of where the research has happened, it's really relevant, because it can give us an indicator of what we might need to be doing when we start thinking about our own systems. I would also say academics don't know what they don't know. So I work with a lot of academics, incredible people, incredibly bright, so knowledgeable. but knowledgeable about specific things. And I remember sitting with a group of land use modelers in a project that I'm involved in a restaurant in Italy. They're all French, and I've not got great French, trying to explain what mob grazing is to these people. Because when they model land use, they go, well, if we're modeling land use, animals are either there or they're not. And I'm like, well, no, they could be there a bit and then have rest, and then they come back. And they just didn't understand that kind of the movement of animals and the development of these more adaptive systems would change how much grass there was available. So when they're modeling how much land do we need to produce the food that we need, they hadn't taken into account these different grazing strategies. And it's not their fault, they just are, not aware of it because it's underrepresented in the literature. We also pretty much know that farmers are operating at 7 to 10 years ahead of research programs. So a research program, let's say it's a 5-year program, by the time it starts and the time it ends, and they've written up everything that they've learned in those 5 years, the farmers have moved on because they've been able to, because farmers can be more fleet of foot than researchers who are invested in significant research programs. So quite often the research that comes out, we're like, yeah, that would have been really helpful 7 years ago, but we've all moved on. It's not the fault of anybody, it's just the way the funding mechanisms and the research programs work. And I would also say that this systems level management, as I've said already, requires system level research, which is complicated. It's not complex, it's complicated, because it involves lots of different people doing lots of different things within lots of different aspects of scientific exploration. But despite all of that, my clicker's stopped. Oh, there we go. Oh God, no, sorry, look, I'm clicking everywhere, and there we go. But despite all of that, some brilliant work did come out of Rothamsted. There's a fantastic report that came out this year, led by Jordana Rivero and her colleagues that Sarah Morgan, who did the graphics for the earlier slides, was involved in. And that found that cell grazing supports double the livestock per hectare of set stocking and delivers environmental benefits, which I'm going to come to in a second, including soil carbon sequestration, which went up, pasture growth, and live weight per hectare. So we can carry more animals. So if you've got a block of land and you think that your carrying capacity is X, with a bit of thinking and a bit of electric fence and a bit of MDP pipe and a water trough, you can increase the carrying capacity of that land. So land's expensive. Rather than buy more land, we can just change our grazing management, carry more animals. So what I think is really, really useful is understanding that this, they've been telling us that from US research for a few years now, but a lot of people in the UK went, well, we don't believe it because it's not been done in the UK. So down at Rothamsted, along with James Daniels from Precision Grazing, they've done this research and they've very clearly got the data that shows all of this information. There's a lot of text on there to read, but all of that has just been lifted straight from the document that is available on the Rothamsted website. So have a look at the work that Sarah, Michael and Jordana have been doing. It's a really easy to read technical report that comes out of that. And you'll be able to see all of the information there that shows that pasture growth and utilization improves, system productivity increases. One thing that they did find was that the daily live weight gain of the individual animals was slightly less in a mob grazing system or in their adaptive multi-paddock system. But if you can carry more animals for longer into the shoulders of the year, it kind of doesn't matter. And I would much rather have more smaller animals than fewer bigger animals, because it means that I'm more resilient, I can split my risk, my cost per head go down, and it really helps us to think about profit and output per hectare, which is way more important than per animal. We need to think more about our land base because that's our limiting factor. So if we can think about our profit from our land base, which is our limiting factor and a really expensive thing that is difficult to trade, then we're going to be much more resilient than if we start thinking about our profit from an individual animal point of view. And again, in the US, the findings were that multi-paddock grazing had superior vegetation composition and biomass. It had higher soil carbon, water, and nutrient holding capacity. Success was very much about this grazing management being adaptive, as I've already mentioned. It's not about we just do this every day for the whole year. It's about creating an adaptive system that's knowledge intensive. It's all about what's going on up here. It also created wildlife habitat and enhanced ecosystem services such as pollination, pest control, and carbon sequestration. So that's Richard Teague's work that is related to the projects that have been done in the US. And I found this was really interesting, right? So mean soil organic matter in that same research project, and they looked at heavy continuous stocking, so set stocking with a high number of animals. The mean soil organic matter was 2.49%. Light continuous, so a lower number of animals but continuously grazing, was 3.24. You start multi-paddock grazing and it goes up to 3.61. And what I found was really fascinating was that grazing exclusion was lower than with AMP. So it kind of shows us that these animals, this isn't about what's the best possible outcome I can get given that we've got to have animals here. Actually, it's about saying, well, animals can deliver. It's better than not having animals there. So from a kind of PR optics point of view, it really delivers for us and can show us that actually these animals are not only, it's not a kind of, we're having animals and this is the best we can possibly get given that we've got to have them here. It's we've got animals and look that they're delivering and it's better than them not being here as long as we manage the grazing right. So soil organic matter is a strong indicator of farm system resilience because it allows us to cope with and be resilient to changing weather patterns. I also just want to touch on some of the work that's been done to look at challenges, particularly in drought years and high weather. So again, taller pastures, more grass. We're going to have a cooler temperature at the soil level, which means that the grass can keep growing and we're able to hold moisture. There's been some really nice work, again, in that same set of projects that has been looking at this to demonstrate that actually if we want to have systems that are more resilient, that can cope with those hotter weather spikes, which do happen every now and again. I know they fade into memory in the UK and Ireland but compared to the US, but it does allow us to have a bit more resilience. And we also know that reducing the feed and input costs by maximising forage absolutely is going to help us to deliver more economically viable and profitable farms. We've also got some work in Pasture for Life that demonstrates Pasture for Life farms are significantly more profitable than their farm benchmark comparators when we start benchmarking across the Farm Business Survey in the UK, well in England. And we also know that the longer someone has been a Pasture for Life member, the higher their soil organic matter. There's a correlation, not a causation, but it's an interesting one at that. So one of the things that I talk about a lot when I get asked to come to stuff like this and quite often go and dig holes and look at soil, and there's always compaction. Like I would say on almost every farm in the UK and Ireland there's going to be compaction. And my view is that compaction is massively affecting our potential, our productivity potential. And I'd be really interested in better understanding the economic implications of soil compaction. And there's work that was done in comparing Ukraine and Lithuania, actually, where they looked at, there was a 27 million euro kind of implication for productivity in Lithuania and 1.6 billion in Ukraine. These are in predominantly arable systems, but I think it'd be really, really interesting to start quantifying what the soil compaction limitations are on a farm in terms of the financial output. So if there's any researchers in here who are interested in that, then I would be really keen to join forces on a call for that, because I think it would be a really, really interesting piece of work to do. But what I would say is that mob grazing, and if you start doing these kind of adaptive multi-paddock mob grazing systems, quite often it will lead you into the wonderful world that is bale grazing winter management. I currently run a bale grazing field lab, and we've got 7 farms that are bale grazing and that we're looking at soil health and forage quality as a result of bale grazing. And then we start kind of getting into the weeds around the cost benefit of that, and actually what we can find is that there's a net financial benefit to the farm when you start shifting that grazing management that works so well in the summer. We start shifting it into the winter, and we're getting a £1.58 per head per day financial benefit to the farm, which is approximately half of the housing cost. And it means that the financial benefit of that winter management maintains the viability of the herd within the wider farm system. And for the farm in question that we looked at, this particular £1.58 net gain equates to a net saving of £22,000 a year. So all of these systems are not only helping us to be more resilient in terms of external weather, climatic shocks, but also enabling better economic viability and farm profitability. Now that's potentially a salary. So if you've got a family farm that aren't paying all of their labour costs, because they're kind of just, you're on the farm, you're doing it anyway, suddenly you've potentially got money to start actually paying people and giving a salary. So what are the challenges? The main thing is the management intensity and the knowledge intensity of this stuff. So I like to think about Regen Ag is about a set of principles, right? So we've got our diversity, livestock integration, disturbance, living roots in the ground, keeping the soil covered. Thinking back to the image that we looked at the very start of the session, But we also have to align that with our context. So what is our setting? Where are we? What are we doing? But also, what are we managing for? What do we want our outcomes to be? And having that always front and center. So we've got our principles, we've got our context, then we come to our toolbox. So I'm a great believer in this idea that every possible way of farming and kind of practical on-the-ground decisions, all they are is a toolbox. That doesn't, mob grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing or no-till, those things in and of themselves are not regenerative. They're only really regenerative if you put them into a picture of, here are the principles and here's my context. So we can use grazing management, we can use machinery, we could use biological stimulants, for example, and in a really degenerative way. But if we align them with our context, what are we managing for? And we then think, well, how do those things relate back to the principles? We're probably more likely to be able to have positive outcomes. And because of the complexity of choosing your principles, identifying your context, and then selecting the appropriate toolbox, the way that research works doesn't really reflect that. So I guess, the challenge is that we have research programs that don't reflect what the decisions are that we're having to actually make on the ground. So there are lots of considerations. I've put a load here, but the one I've put in bold is mindset. But also, community is key. So this is just a couple of snaps from a WhatsApp group that we were running for a group of farmers in the Cairngorm National Park in Scotland who were looking into changing their grazing management. And it was everything from what fence testers should I be using through to what are these flowers that I found in my field since I've created a bit more rest. So if this is stuff that you're interested in, it's amazing that you're at an event like this today, but find some sort of WhatsApp group that you want to join. There's an amazing WhatsApp group called Mob Grazing UK. Don't let the UK bit put you off if you're from south of the border. Anyone's welcome to join. It's a brilliant WhatsApp group. We've got about 300 people nearly on it now who are all mob grazing, AMP grazing in some way across the UK and Ireland. We've also got a few folk from the Isle of Man, which is great as well, because I think they were feeling a little bit left out without any kind of WhatsApp groups to join. If you want to join, come and find me. I'm one of the admins and I'll add you to it. And it's a really great space for inspiration, to ask stupid questions, to get help, to get advice, and also just to update each other so we don't all feel like we're kind of on our own in our fields doing this. For me as a social scientist, the most important thing to ask is to ask farmers what they think. So in that mob grazing group, I asked all the guys in it, what's good about mob grazing, what's good about AMP grazing? And these are the things that they said. They said, give grass a rest and good things happen. One of them said, the daily visit from Kestrel whilst moving cows is fairly special. Hadn't seen him for a while. Then I moved the cows onto longer covers and suddenly he appears as soon as the quad bike rolls up. So this connection with land and this connection with actually what's happening in those biological systems suddenly becomes very clear. Major health issues disappear. Grass grows grass a lot. Hot weather, cool, moist microclimate, daily rhythm of moving, voles, birds, butterflies. So, for me, this is more important than a research study that said this happens, because this is real farmers on a daily basis. And as a social scientist, that's really what kind of matters to me. So what I would ask is, what's stopping you from doing this stuff? And thanks ever so much for your time this morning.